If you're looking for a Skywalker lightsaber and you're not sure which one to get, this video is for you. We're going to start with Anakin's lightsaber. And now I know within canon, technically this is supposed to be Anakin's and it's passed on throughout each trilogy. But when you're referring to the lightsaber itself, you have to refer to which prop was being used, right? So Revenge of the Sith Skinnyflex, I don't call it a Graflex because I'll explain what a Graflex is in a second, was specifically machined and made just for that movie. It is not seen in any other movie. It's not a Graflex flash gun. It's literally its own thing. It's got a cover tech. It's got the brass eye. It's got the brass button. It's a different clamp card, a different clamp switch, completely different clamp. The grips are different, and it's all over skinnier and longer. Now, I know the argument will be made that, well, these are Anakin's too. I understand what you're saying, but again, if you're referencing what the lightsaber is, you have to go by what movie it's from, because it's just easier for someone within the lightsaber community to understand that, right? So now I'm going to go to the middle one here, which is A New Hope. It's a vintage Graflex, right? So this is an actual flash handle that was from a Graflex camera, and we converted it to look like Episode 4 because that's what they did for that movie, right? Notice the rivets, the grips are uneven, the bubble card, and then you've got everything that's kind of vintage, and it's made to look like a Fulmer. This is not an actual Fulmer stamped. Just to kind of give you an idea of what the differences are, right? So this is what they actually used in those movies. Now, moving on to the sequel trilogy, it's been confirmed that they use Roman props, replicas of a Graflex flash handle. Well, what's the difference? Well, one is made to look almost identical to a vintage, but is not an actual vintage, right? So this is Episode 9's. Obviously, the clamp is different, but if you went to Episode 7, they printed the clamp without the Graflex on it to keep it in universe, right? Now, on the Episode 9, you have the weld flex, right? That's what I like to refer it as. You can call it whatever you want. Ray flex, people call it. But the main differences that I've noticed between the vintage and a replica is the sizing, the machining, and kind of the sheen, right? You might not be able to, the camera might not pick it up, but the sheen is different. For some reason, the replicas always are a little bit shinier to me, where the vintage have a little bit more of a duller kind of look. But it's still pretty, it still looks cool, it just is a little bit duller of a look. The other thing is, there's a spring in here on the bottom for the vintages. Now, I know some companies, when they make a replica, they'll put that in there just to keep it as close as possible, and that's to hold batteries. But it can change per hilt, per maker. Over here on the far left is going to be the 7 Chambers Aniflex. Currently, this is the most accurate Anakin lightsaber on the market. The only negative for me is that the cover tech does not fit a typical cover tech clip, which is what they used in the prequels to hold the lightsabers. The main differences, I mean, there's a lot between a Graflex and a Skinnyflex. First off is the overall length, and I said also the width, right? On top of that, the clamp card, brass eye, brass button. The pins are even different. They're not even close to the same as a Graflex pins. The blade holder is different. The bunny ears, right, are different. It's not springed like this at all. It doesn't have the slide switch. That's completely missing. So there's a lot of things that are different. That's why it confuses me why this was used for Episode 3. I understand it's what George Lucas saw as his vision, but it doesn't really line up with the rest of the movies. Now, moving on to a vintage versus a replica. The first thing off the bat that I always notice is how the bunny ears are attached. I'm going to take off this red button just so you can see it a little bit better. This is actually riveted in, right? So that can't go anywhere. That's stuck in there unless you were to drill it out. All right. Now, most replicas, because they want it installable, it is not. It's actually a screw, and it screws all the way down to keep the bunny ears in. So that's the main difference that I would notice right off the rip. The other thing, again, like I said, was the sheen. But other than that, there's not that much of a difference. You can just tell a difference of when you hold a vintage versus a replica. And while my episode 9 doesn't have the stamping, it's because I covered it up because that's not accurate for that episode, right? Now, the main differences between A New Hope and episode 9 are vast, right? It's kind of night and day. You've got the bubble card. The clamp orientation is on the opposite side. The eye is different, right? This is a Fulmer eye. I don't know if you can see the difference. That's a Fulmer eye. This is just a regular Graflex eye. The sequel trilogy is the only ones that actually had shine through, so you could actually see the light coming through the eye. The pins are different, right? These are smooth pins. These are not. They have little like notches in them, if that makes sense. Obviously the grips are different. There's a different amount, different thickness, different cut. The episode 9 has rivets, right, for each. On top of that, it's got this whole clamp section is completely different. You've got the little rivets going all the way there. The clamp card is different. Obviously you have the weld marks on top of that. And then how it's held is even different. So it's a slip clip. So you literally can clip it to anything, right? So you could clip it to your waistband, to your pocket, whatever. The original trilogy had D-rings, right? Now this D-ring's not accurate anymore. There's a different one that I have to replace it with. It's called the wonky D-ring. But the point is that these were D-rings. The other difference between, and we're going to jump back to Revenge of the Sith, right, is how it's even constructed, right? Here we have the J-lock system, which you will have for a vintage as well as a replica. Same thing, J-lock. Now, another difference that I wanted to touch on is sound venting, right? Something that's made to have sound versus something that's not. So on a vintage, you would actually have to drill holes, and you can hide it underneath D-rings or kobolds or whatever to make sure that it's still hidden and you don't see it. But the sound venting for a Graflex is always, in my opinion, not very good. Now this episode 9 one is the best out of the Graflexes that I've had because Cal over at KR Sabers actually sound vented it for you previous to you having the hilt. So you can see all the little slits, and this is the best one, the best sounding Graflex that I've ever had. Now in comparison to the Aniflex blows it out of the water hands down because it's made to hold electronics. That was the whole point of this, right? Now when someone does a replica of a Graflex, they just want to get it as close to a vintage as they can. That's the difference. Now, if you're getting one of these for it to sound good, I'm going to warn you, it is going to sound muffled no matter what you do. I have done venting in the rivets. I've done venting in the bottom like this before. I've done hidden venting on a D-ring. It just always sounds muffled no matter what I do. And again, it's purely because these aren't made to be installed. They were made to flash light for a camera, and that's just a fact. It's not that you shouldn't get one, but just be prepared that when you hold it up in comparison to something like a Skinny Flex or say just a custom hilt in general that's not even in the movies, that's made to have sound, it is going to sound better. It's just a fact. So price point. Over here we have Anakin's lightsaber from episode 3. The most accurate on the market is going to be the 7 chambers Aniflex, which is this one is. It'll run you about $260 depending on where you buy it from. Now in the middle over here we have a vintage. Now with the vintage you start with nothing. You start with a blank canvas. You have to start from the ground up. You have to buy the grips, the grip guide, the card, all that fun stuff. Now these can range between $600 to $1,000. Can even push past that depending on the stamping, which is the bottom, whatever it reads, which can be Fulmer, Graflex ink, which changes depending on which movie it was in, and depending on what you're looking for. And it can also depend on the condition of the flash handle. If it's in really poor condition, obviously it's going to be a little bit cheaper. Now that's just for the piece, right? That's not with it installed. Now over here, this one was a little bit more expensive, but you can get the episode 9 kit from KR Sabers, which is essentially what this is. It comes with the stencils for the weld marks, It is mostly DIY, but it's not really all that extensive. I really think anybody can do it, especially with his explanation video. It's not super complicated. But ours specifically is a Romans top with his conversion kit. And the reason we did that is because Romans was used in most of the sequel trilogy. So we wanted it as close as possible. The only thing that's left for us is this is actually not aligned properly. It has to be 1 over. So I'll have to grind down the J-locks to move it. But this one, I think in total is roughly $250. And the expense for installing these range as well. The cheapest install, surprisingly, is actually the Aniflex because it's set up for an install, right? It was made specifically to be installed. Very similarly to the actual prop of the movie, was just made for the movie. That wasn't something in real life that they converted to make for the movie. Now, the Vintage obviously is made to be a flash handle, so it flashes for a camera to take a picture. It wasn't meant to be a lightsaber, so there's some tricky things you need to do to make it work, to make it installable. First, that spring has to come out, and you have to replace the actual flash parts that are inside here, right, that holds all this where the light shoots out, with a blade holder, which adds to the expensive part. So the most expensive one to install is definitely the middle of Vintage. A good middle of the ground, but to still have an actual Graflex, because again, I do not consider this a Graflex, would be a Replica. Mainly because, again, they're not necessarily made just to be installed, but they're more install friendly than a Vintage. You still need a blade holder to be able to hold the blade, and then the chassis, depending on what you choose, has to be made for it as well. But that is same for over here. The chassis need to be made for vice versa. But the chassis for a Vintage and a Replica are typically the same. You just need to do more work on a Vintage to make it install friendly. So this was just an overview, just to kind of give you an idea of which is which, because I've had a few customers come to me saying that they want, a Graflex from episode 3, and the only reason that can get confusing is because technically this isn't a Graflex. So that's why I refer to it as a Skinnyflex and Aniflex, basically Anakin's episode for Revenge of the Sith. If you're going to say a Graflex replica, you're talking about a replica. If you're talking about a Vintage, you're talking about a Vintage. Just to kind of give you an idea of what the terminology is, so that when you're asking for certain things, we know what you're asking for. It's a little bit easier for installers and sabersmiths to kind of understand if you understand the lingo as well. So just brass tacks real quick, we're going to go over it. Skinnyflex, Aniflex, right? Vintage Graflex, Graflex Replica. Okay, this is an episode 4, this is an episode 9. So if you're going to refer to a Graflex, usually saying by episode or scene specifically is the best way to do it, because even the scenes, the lightsabers do change throughout the sequel trilogy as well as the original trilogy. Like Empire Strikes Back, I know that there's 3+ Graflexes that Luke uses throughout the movie, and they all have differences to them, and you can find replicas based on the scene or make it look a certain way based on the scene. Now for the sequel trilogy, it's changed each movie, but also in certain scenes. Like the main difference for the sequel trilogies would be the specific scene in The Force Awakens when the First Order shows up and Finn has the Graflex on Takodana. It looks different than when Rey has it later in the forest scene. So the differences can be based on scene as well. So my recommendation, I will put it in the description below, the Wanawanga Lightsaber guidebook, and it covers mostly the original trilogy as well as some of the sequel trilogy hilts, and then the prequel hilts really aren't touched on all that much because they were made specifically for those movies, and they didn't really give out that much information about how they were made, where they were made, what the differences were. Most of them were pretty much the same because they just cast them in resin and then would hand them to them. So they all kind of pretty much look the same. There's not that many differences except for the stunt lightsabers, which we'll make a separate video on. But other than that, that's an overview. It's an easy way to distinguish between them is based on the movie plus the character that used it, not whose hilt it actually is canonically. I understand that canonically this is Anakin's, right? All the way through each film. I understand that. But if you're trying to reference on what you're looking to purchase, you need to be specific about whether it's an actual Graflex what movie it's from, what scene it's from, what character was wielding it. But that's a basic overview.